Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello and welcome to the London part of the show. I'm Jo Coburn. Joining me for the duration of the programme, Jackie Doyle-Price, Conservative MP for Thurrock, and Sarah Jones, Labour MP for Croydon Central. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Under Sadiq Khan, London has witnessed an enormous surge in knife crime. Offences are up by almost a third on a year ago. Having enjoyed good poll ratings during his honeymoon period in office, the Mayor now finds himself under real pressure for the first time. But could an answer to the problem be found north of the border in Scotland, where 10 years ago, after being faced with similar levels of violence on the streets, the government started to treat knife crime as a health issue? The result appears to have been a dramatic improvement, and the Met Police Commissioner Cressida Dick says the capital should now follow suit. But what exactly would it mean in practice? Andrew Cryan has been to Scotland to find out.
The back half of the 20th century saw Scotland, and Glasgow in particular, become victim to an epidemic of knife crime which claimed hundreds of lives. This is Desmond. He witnessed knife violence firsthand from a very young age, and eventually became an offender as well, before turning his life around.
I was brought up with a mother like on drugs. Her partners were always violent, so it was always knives getting flung about, or scissors, or like kitchen knives. I was only a kid, so they're scary, so that's protection to them, so a knife will protect me. Like people say, if you carry a knife, you intend to use it. If I pull a knife out on someone for a fight, I either use it on them or they take it off me and they use it on me. So I was in a fight in Glasgow when I stayed in Hope House. I was selling drugs, and someone tried to take my drugs off me, so I had to pull my knife out. And it was the first time I went to use it, and I was scared. And I was just like, I need to show them I'm not scared, so I just stabbed the guy. But I didn't stab him I didn't know where I was going to stab him, but I stabbed him in the side. And when I stabbed him, then I thought it wasn't as bad as what I thought it was. And I thought I could do that again. But I don't know what the feeling it was, but it was like power.
For years, people tried and failed to find a solution.
Now, a little over a decade ago, things in Scotland had got incredibly serious. A report by the United Nations found that it was the most violent country in all of the developed world. You were 3 times more likely to be assaulted if you were a Scot than if you were American, and 30 times more likely than if you were Japanese. But since then, there's been a remarkable change.
Since the mid-noughties, the murder rate has halved. Crimes involving handling an offensive weapon are down by 2/3, and violence is at the lowest rate for nearly half a century. All of this has happened at the same time that something called a public health approach has been taken to the issue. Fundamental to that change was a group of medics.
We were all seeing huge numbers of young people coming through hospital doors who'd been injured as a result of violence, and we felt that we wanted to do something about that.
The World Health Organization had recently recommended trying to understand violence as if it was a disease.
If you get involved in a situation where your friends are involved in violence, it's likely to spread throughout your friend group. And you know, we had a big problem 10 years ago with young people hanging about in gangs, and that was just something that became expected of that kind of social structure. So it's kind of like an infection.
And the public health approach means using scientific methodology to treat violence like a virus.
Essentially, the public health approach involves trying to decide what your problem is. So you obviously need some data and some analysis. You then have a look at what interventions might work to deal with the problem. You then test them out, and if they work, you scale them up and try and reach as many people as you possibly can.
It was an idea taken up by the Scottish authorities. Helped by a new body called the Violence Reduction Unit, the new approach tied together schools, hospitals, youth services, whoever could be shown to make a real difference.
The key thing here is to recognise that if you want to tackle the issue of violent crime, and knife crime in particular, is not to simply think that it's about increasing the sentences for individuals who are convicted of these crimes, that it's simply about more policing. The criminal justice system has an important part to play, but the key to it is preventing it from happening in the first place. That's about working with young people who might be getting involved in violent crime, that might be carrying knives, and trying to understand exactly why they're carrying knives and why they think they need to get involved in violence, and what you can do to prevent them from getting involved in it in the first place.
And now part of that solution is Des, who we met at the beginning of this report. He's been going around schools, warning young people away from the path he took.
Life's a circle. As long as one person can change, that one person can help someone else change, and it can just go round in a circle. And the more people that we get to help people, the more people that we can get to give someone a helping hand, can change the world. I mean, less violence, less crimes, less people in prison, less drug using.
And here in London, people are taking notice. Met Police Commissioner Cressida Dick, this week taking part in a hunt for knives in front of TV cameras, says that we too should be following a public health approach to the problem, just like Scotland has. But whether we can manage the scale and success of the Scottish experiment is a different question altogether.
Well, I'm joined in the studio by Temi Mwale from the organisation Forefront, which tries to help young people escape a life of violence, and the Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, Sophie Linden. Welcome to both of you. Sophie Linden, first of all, are you signed up to adopting this public health approach?
Absolutely. I mean, we've learnt the lessons from Scotland and from elsewhere, such as New York. We published a strategy to tackle knife crime last year, where we very clearly put a public health agenda into the middle of it. We can only tackle knife crime if it's not just around policing and the criminal justice service, as the package says, but by working with schools, families, communities, and with the health service. So
how much money have you pledged to actually financing and working in this way?
So in the face of massive government cuts across England and Wales and in London, schools are facing a £99 million funding gap next year alone. The Mayor is investing and putting money up front in terms of preventative work with young people, but also investing in policing. But frankly, that's not going to be enough. The government needs to step up and reverse the cuts. London has seen 30 youth centres close over the course of the last administration. This is having a real impact on the lives of young people.
Could the Mayor be contributing more? Would you like to see Sadiq Khan pledging more money before you go to central government?
In the face of really large government cuts, the Mayor is putting the money in that he can, but it's not going to fill that gap. The government needs to step up if it's serious about tackling violence.
How much money do you think is required to fund a successful public health approach?
Well, we know after years of underfunding that 30 youth centres in London have closed. That's about 13,000 places for young people. As I've said already, schools are facing a funding gap.
Sure, but a figure, what sort of money are you talking about?
Well, we need to look at exactly what, filling that gap. And what we have done is we have put money and invested money into services and into policing, but we need the government to step up and put the money where it's needed.
Jackie Doyle-Price, should the government be putting, central government be putting real cash behind this sort of approach? What is a crisis in terms of knife crime in London?
The reality is the government can only spend as much money as it collects from people and taxpayers, so therefore we need to make a choice about how we spend it. What I would say, however, is that investing in this kind of programme actually saves. Because we're taking cost out of policing if we can actually get that behavioural change, but it will take time to actually embed a system where we're changing young people's behaviour and people are spending less activity carrying knives.
Right, but you would see then more funds. You would like to see more funds going from central government because in the long term it would save money.
We need to be smarter about how we spend.
Have you, Sophie, visited the Violence Reduction Unit in Glasgow?
I've met the present lead of the Violence Reduction Unit in Glasgow. We've certainly looked at it when we were developing the knife crime strategy, and many of the things that they've been doing, and they have been doing it for years, and that is very, very important. There aren't short-term solutions to this.
Do you think
learning the lessons?
Do you think it's important if you went up there and actually learnt the lessons face-to-face and see the unit in operation?
We're always keen to learn lessons, and we will always make sure that we can learn where we can.
Right. Are you going to set up a violence reduction unit along the same sorts of lines?
We have a specific unit within, we have a unit within MOPAC, the Mayor's Office of Police and Crime, that's looking at violence. And across London, of course, Scotland is very different to London. We have 32 boroughs and we have different mechanisms and governance. But absolutely, we want to make sure that we have this public health approach alongside really good, effective enforcement.
Temi, what's your reaction? This is obviously the sort of rhetoric and the sort of warm words that you want to hear from the police, but do you think this is the real action that is needed to tackle knife crime in this way?
I've personally visited the VRU in Scotland, and I think we have learned a lot of lessons, but we're not implementing them, we're not putting them in practice. So in terms of endorsing a public health approach, that's one thing, but actually taking the steps required to implement the public health approach, that's something different, which I don't think we've seen enough movement towards that yet.
Do you think the commitment is there, though, to do something?
I think a lot of people have made a commitment publicly. If we can see this endorsed on paper through the strategies and policies, then we can have more faith that it might take shape.
One of the problems, Sophie, historically, has been a lack of trust between black and minority ethnic communities and the police in London. What are you doing to improve that?
So just in terms of the policing, we are reintroducing neighbourhood policing, which I think is a very important aspect of ensuring that local communities know their police and the police know their local communities. But also we've got a commitment, and we already have about 300 Metropolitan Police officers in the secondary schools of London working with young people so that their first engagement encounter with the police isn't in that confrontational situation.
One of the things that I think the community finds very difficult is the issue of stop and search. Why are black people 4 times more likely to be stopped and searched?
We recognise some of the complexities around stop and search and some of the worries that young people have in London around stop and search. But stop and search is an effective tactic for keeping knives and weapons off the streets. And what the Mayor and myself have been saying, and the Commissioner said this week, and I was there on that the knife sweep that you filmed, is that you should expect an increase in stop and search over the next coming months. Where there's an increase in knife crime and an increase in violence, you should expect an increase in stop and search.
With more black people being stopped disproportionately.
What's important is that stop and search is done effectively. It is done in an intelligence-led way, and to ensure that it's those people who are you've got intelligence of carrying knives that are stopped and searched in the appropriate way and in the right way.
Tell me, do you welcome an increase in stop and search?
No, I don't. I think, but when campaigners and activists like myself make these comments about stop and search, sometimes they can be misinterpreted. We're not saying that in the interactions where weapons are found and removed that, OK, stop and search is bad. We're saying a blanket rollout every time we see the figures to say that there's an increase in violence, that the only approach we have is a rapid increase in stop and search. That's not effective. And I'll just say one thing about that relationship between young people, particularly young black people, and the police. And I've made this argument before. These young people, when they feel their lives are under threat, they're not calling the police. There's no trust or relationship for them to use the police as the conflict reduction that they're supposed to be. So the increase in stop and search, that just further, erodes that relationship.
Do you accept that?
I absolutely recognise that we have an issue with certain sections of young people, not just black young people, but some white young people as well, where trust and confidence is an issue.
And stop and search is one of the
stop
motivating
and search
factors.
Can be an issue in that what matters is that it's done effectively, but also what matters is that there is a good transparency and accountability, and officers are held to account. Body-worn video, which has been rolled out across London, is a game changer in this because both sides have a record of the interaction. It is reducing complaints as we speak.
Do you support the shift towards an increase in stop and search again, Sarah?
I think what we have to do is look at this in the round, right? So what do we want London to be? We want London to be the safest city in the world, don't we? That's what we want it to be. We want people to come here, to live here,
sure,
to be content, and our greatest asset...
No one would disagree with that.
Our greatest asset in doing that is our young people. They are the ones that are going to create the society that we want to live in.
So should stop and search be increased on the streets of London?
Just to finish, the first aim is to enable our young people to be the wonderful people they can be and to achieve what they want to achieve and to have safe, happy lives. Now, part of the policing aspect of this is stop and search, of course it is, but it is a much bigger problem, and it is more about, schools. The number of expulsions has gone up dramatically. What happens to those children in London? What is it like to be a young person in London? What messages are we giving them that all we're going on about is the kind of crimes and not their ability to do what they want to do? So the public health approach that they've done in Scotland, that has taken 10, 15 years, that looks at every single aspect of young people's lives and says, what do we need to put in place? Surely that's the right approach, and that's where you start.
So is the Mayor, Sadiq Khan, correct? Do you support his policy shift to increasing stop and search again, rather than taking this holistic approach?
Exactly as Sophie said, it's a very complicated issue, and you've got to be super careful to try and take the community with you. And to me, we have to look at the results that stop and search bring. So at the moment, something like 1 in 3 stop and searches, they find something which shows that they're targeting appropriately. Back in the day, that was like 1 in 10, which was far worse and led to huge understandable conflict in our communities. So we need to do it properly, and there's a role to it, but it is nowhere near the biggest part of the solution here.
I mean, Temi, one of the issues is that reducing stop and search doesn't seem to have increased trust. So in a way, it hasn't solved the problem. When stop and search was cut, when it was reduced, it hasn't led to this better relationship between black and minority ethnic communities and the police.
No, I completely agree with you. Let me just be blunt about it. You're not just going to do one tactic that's going to reverse decades and decades of mistrust and a bad relationship that's been constructed over. It's an intergenerational problem. It's a historical problem. So this is stop and search is a continuation of the sus laws that we saw decades ago. Young people know this. Their communities have had problems with it. Their parents had problems with it. Their grandparents had problems with it. And therefore, it's going to take more than just this one action to build the trust again between these communities.
Jackie Daw-Price, do you think it is right to move away from a sort of criminal justice style approach to a purely public health approach in the way they did in Scotland?
I wouldn't see it as either or, actually. I think, given that it takes time to embed behavioural change, which a public health approach is designed to achieve, you've got to have a programme of enforcement alongside of that. It is carrot and stick at the end of the day.
It is so serious because of the numbers that we are talking about and the tragedies that we see every week or so on the evening news, particularly over the Christmas and New Year period. Do you think that there need to be tougher mandatory sentences for people carrying knives?
Look, if there was tougher sentences, there'd be no, and then that worked, there'd be no crime in America, right? If we just locked people up and that was the solution, everything would be fixed. We've got a binary decision to make. Either things carry on as they are, and knife crime goes up and down as it does, or we do something about it. And the only way to look at it is to look at it from a point of view of poverty, aspiration, inequality, jobs, mental health, education, and put all of those pillars in place.
Right, do you agree with that?
Well, as with all things, we tend to, when it falls into criminal activity, that's where society has failed. So the more you can intervene early to prevent these things, absolutely, that is absolutely the right way to go.
Right, because do you accept, Sophie, that the problem here is that actually a lot of the young people in London are more frightened of being attacked and injured with a knife than they are actually about going to prison?
So when we were developing the knife crime strategy, which we published last year and is being delivered at the moment, we spoke to many young people in prison and out of prison, and they told us it was around, they were worried and they were scared about carrying the knife. I absolutely agree with Sarah and with Jackie and with Temi that this has to be much wider. It's not, as the film said, it's not just simply criminal justice or simply enforcement. They have their place, they are important, sentencing, stop and search, enforcement, but we have to get to the root causes, and in order to do that we have to really face up, and the government has to face up to the fact that the cuts and the money that's coming out of those vital services is really impacting on young people's lives.
But I say again, we can only spend what we collect from taxpayers, and that's causing tough choices and decisions to be made. But we have to decide what our priorities are and what we need to tackle.
And I would say tackling violence is an absolute priority.
Yeah. Sophie and Temi, thank you both very much for coming in. With the demise of the construction and private public service provider Carillion, just how will London cope in shoring up the damage done to transport, libraries, prisons, police training and much more? And should the capital be calling time on outsourcing such public services to private companies? Jerry Thomas has this.
Since it went bust on Monday, Carillion's vast network of operations across London have been left in the lurch. They were involved in the construction of more than 1,000 homes in the capital, in what may be a blow to the Mayor's house-building target. One of Carillion's largest public sector contracts was a £12 million refurbishment of St Heliers Hospital in South London. The authorities have acted to ensure the continuation of services, but it's sparking a debate about the merits of PFI contracts. A National Audit Office report this week said hospitals built under PFI contracts cost 70% more than if the government borrowed the money itself. Carillion was responsible for maintaining some of London's largest prisons, from Pentonville to Wandsworth. Even before the company failed this week, the conditions in the prisons they ran had been severely criticised by the Independent Monitoring Board. Meanwhile, library services in Croydon that had been run by Carillion have been brought in-house. The Mayor has questioned whether contracts such as these should have been given in the first place.
There needs to be an urgent investigation into all that went on at Carillion, all that went on in relation to new contracts given by the government to Carillion, when everyone else appeared to know that this company was in danger.
A collapse of this magnitude may well make it more difficult for the government to justify outsourcing in the future.
Sarah, the collapse of Carillion, this major construction company involved in building 1,000 homes at the time of liquidation, how is that going to affect Sadiq Khan's housing target?
Well, we need to investigate exactly, where they're involved, what the contracts are and what can be done about it. And I think the government has to, step in and do all of the right things in terms of making sure where there's public sector contracts, but also where there's private sector contracts, because these are people's jobs and people's livelihoods and that people's jobs are protected and the work gets done. And I think there's a big job of work to do first and foremost to make sure we're building the things we need to build. I mean, Network Rail has a lot of contracts with Carillion, and I need in Croydon, we desperately need some upgrades to our train lines because it's falling over as it is, and if we don't get that investment, then people won't be able to get to work and everything will grind to a halt. So we absolutely need to sort this all out, and I think setting up the task force, but going much further in terms of making sure people's jobs and pensions are supported as well. I've had emails, I don't know about you, from people who've got Carillion pensions who are really worried about what's going to happen to them.
Jackie, do you think there is a philosophical argument now to have that there should be an end to big public sector contracts delivering vital services being given to a private company like Carillion in the future?
I wouldn't go anywhere near as far as that, Joe, but I think there is an issue about how we manage public sector contracts. I spent 5 years on the Public Accounts Committee and saw a lot of these contracts up close, and I think there is an issue about how particularly some departments manage contracting out. We could be a whole lot better at this.
Right.
And I think what we've ended up with a system which has tended to generate big monopolies in the private sector doing public sector work, and there are a lot of risks associated with that, and if there's any learning to be done from this, I think that's the lesson that we need to really act on.
Right. Do you accept that the government's defence is that they don't want to put a private firm going bust, the costs of that, onto the taxpayer, onto the London taxpayer?
I think we've got to look at the cost of lots of these massive contracts that are costing the taxpayer lots of money in the first place, and I think we need to have a look at how we do this. So
should it end then, that relation? Should public contracts be given to private companies like Carillion in the future?
I think there's a balance to be struck, and as Jeremy Corbyn said, where things are failing, we need to look at that. But in the main, we want public sector contracts to be within the public sector. But two things.
So you do want to try and bring everything in house.
If I could just try and just make say two things that have happened. One is that government ministers didn't meet with Carillion to talk about this issue over the last few months, and the other is that the banks, one of the chief execs of one of the banks that decided not to support Carillion, said that the decision didn't even come across his desk. So here we have a decision about tens of thousands of jobs, and it's not going anywhere near ministers or anywhere near the chief execs of banks. So clearly that structure is not working. And the Independent Monitoring Board, Jackie, had repeatedly criticised Carillion for poor maintenance of prisons, but they were able to hold on to the contracts. Why? Again, that's something we need to look at in terms of how we manage these contracts, because there is a lot of benefit from transferring the risk to private sector providers. What are they? So long, well, value for money, you can hold them to account. Let's not pretend that when we had companies in national ownership throughout the 70s, everything was perfect. It was not. There was a reason we moved to outsourcing things to the private sector. But it only works if the contract is suitable and fit for purpose. And I think ministers and civil servants need to be a lot more vigilant about making sure that it will deliver for the taxpayer. All right. Well, thank you to both of you for being our guests today on the programme. That's Jackie Doyle-Price and Sarah Jones.